Okay, hello, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to take you through one of my favourite games that Emory Tate played in his career. Before we start delving into this masterpiece, I wanted to show you guys just how impressive this game is by telling you a bit about the context and his opponent. What I'm about to show you is the round 5 game in the US Masters tournament in 1997. At this point, both Tate and his opponent were in their late 30s, and while Tate was rated 2344 and was 2,143rd in the world rankings, his opponent was a man by the name of Leonid Yudisin. He was 60th in the world, rated 2638. If you think that's impressive, let me tell you, Leonid Yudisin was a formidable player. Only 3 years prior to this game, he had narrowly lost to Kramnik in the quarterfinals of the 1994 FIDE candidates, and at his peak rating, he was 5th in the world, behind only Kasparov, Karpov, Ivanchuk, and Gelfand. 4 legends of the game. Now, I want you guys to all keep this context in mind while watching how Emory Tate dismantles this man in this game. Okay, so let's get into the game. Tate opens with the move e4, and we see a Sicilian defense. Knight f3, an open Sicilian, and d6, really characteristic of all the modern variations of the Sicilian. Tate plays d4, and after cd4 and knight d4, we see the move a6 from Yudisin. Now, for those of you who aren't generally speaking familiar with Sicilian defenses, this a6 move might look a bit passive and a bit strange. What it does is basically clamp down on that b5 square, not allowing the knight or bishop or potential knight from c3 to access it, and it's actually a really common move. It sets up one of the most strongly researched theoretical lines in all of chess, that is the Sicilian defense najdorf variation. Now, normally we would enter the najdorf variation by playing knight c3 here and then knight to f6, and this is the najdorf. Generally speaking, black puts the bishop on g7 and castles kingside. It's a really dynamic opening with some very non-committal pawn moves from black and very interesting. However, we don't see this in this game. Instead, sharp as always, Emory Tate plays bishop to c4. And after knight f6, we see knight to c3, and you can see that we've actually transposed into the najdorf variation just with this extra move, bishop c4. This bishop c4 approach to the najdorf is more formally known as the Lipnitsky attack, and there have been 7,000 master games in the Lee Chess database that have this position, and in 96% of them, black has played e6. Yudisin is no exception, so we see e6 here, and Tate just drops the bishop back to b3. In response to this, Yudisin plays knight b to d7, and it's not entirely clear why the knight doesn't go to its natural developing square on c6 until we see that after queen e2, Yudisin goes for knight c5 and attacks the bishop. Here it seems that black's done quite well in this opening. There is no way to maintain the bishop pair for white. Even if they try to go bishop c4, then b5, bishop d3, the knight can still trade itself up for that bishop. And up to this point, we've seen some fairly standard chess, and that is not what you've clicked on this video to see. Well, you are in luck, as this would not be Tate content without some aggression. And while his son prefers to show that aggression through kickboxing, Emory Tate likes to beat up his opponents with moves like g4. The idea behind this move g4 is that it lashes out towards the knight and also more generally towards black's kingside. Now, if we have a look at the pawn structure over here on black's queenside, it becomes very clear that castling queenside is not going to be a very safe idea. There are plenty of holes in this position, and black's king is not going to be very safe there. So lashing out towards the king side is a very aggressive statement, saying you're not going to be safe over there, you're not going to be safe in the center, and you're sure as hell not going to be safe on the king side because I am lashing out very, very quickly here. After b5, a very common Sicilian idea, continuing with this expansion and part of the reason that black plays a6 in the first place, we see g5 attacking the knight, and the knight steps back to d7. In this position, it is clear that white has a very aggressive setup, but surely not enough of the game has passed on move 10, and surely white's super grandmaster opponent hasn't played passively enough that a sacrifice is already possible. Well, Tate disagrees and plays the beautiful bishop to d5. Now, a lot of you may be thinking, as I was, how on earth is this move playable? I mean, does it not just hang to this pawn? And if you saw this in a Guess the Elo episode on Levi Rosman's channel, you would think this was some 400 rated gameplay. But this is an international master we're talking about, and a very talented one at that. As it happens, Yudisin does not take this bishop in the game. I'll show you what would have happened if he did take the bishop though. So if we saw pawn takes bishop, then we'd see knight to c6, hitting the queen. And after the queen moves, we would see pawn takes on d5 with discovered check here. And after black in this position, I mean, they don't want to play bishop e7 and get checkmated in one. After they play knight to e5, then we see f4 attacking the knight. And while this isn't winning per se for white, it's a very, very dynamic battlefield on which to play, and it's very hard, I think, for black in a position like this, where somehow there's a knight outposted on c6. You know, black has to play pretty perfectly just to end up in a position that's not even that good for them. Yudison does not take the bishop, instead playing bishop b7, which Tate immediately trades off, undeveloping the knight from the c5 square. And there are some long-term, quite deep idea benefits to not having a light squared bishop on the board for black, which we'll explore later. Tate plays a4 here, a very common idea when your opponent has a pawn on b5, and after takes and knight c5, kicking the rook back to a3, we see that this rook has gained access to a lot more of the board than it could see, generally speaking, when it was on a1. After queen b6, however, Tate now plays one of the most outrageous moves that I have ever seen, and simply castles kingside. I don't know how one man can have the guts to do such a thing. This is Stockfish's top move, castling kingside under this g5 pawn, which is, I mean, yeah, it looks ridiculous. But after bishop to e7 here, we see that idea of trading off the light squared bishops as Tate plays king to h1, putting his king on a square that is only feasibly accessible down this light squared diagonal, him having removed the light squared attacker earlier. It's a brilliant bit of play, knowing that structurally speaking, this pawn being pushed means this diagonal's weaker, trading off those light squared bishops with that beautiful maneuver from b3 to d5, and then taking it this way. Just very, very deep stuff and very, very clever stuff, and something that's really instructional, and I think you guys should pay attention to. Yudison castles here, and Tate plays a b4, just another. Every move feels like it needs like a paragraph of explanation, because look at this, he's hung a pawn, but actually has he? Because then knight to c6, forking the queen and the bishop, and if the queen goes back to b7, then takes king h8, and it seems this knight's trapped. However, then queen h5, and if you go and try and take the knight, knight to d5, and if you try and take this knight, then let's throw away the queen on h7, king takes, and rook h3 checkmate. There are these kind of crazy lines, that rook having access to h3 being a very fundamental idea. There are these kind of crazy lines in this position. Tate needs to have basically seen this to be able to play the move b4 as he does. So even these simple moves, kicking a knight, just taking a lot of thought and a lot of genius, if I do say so. Yudison, obviously being a super grandmaster and having his peak at 5th in the world, sees this and plays knight to a4. If we see knight takes here, then we will see queen takes knight here. But instead of caring about anything that's going on over on this side of the board, Tate plays another beautiful sacrifice, knight to f5. After Yudison takes, he has deflected the pawn here from the defense of that d5 square, allowing Tate to play knight d5, the queen having to return back to d8 to defend this bishop here, a similar fork that we investigated earlier. And Tate plays e takes f5. Look at these pawns. After Yudison plays rook to e8, Tate goes queen h5, sliding out of that e-file and exerting pressure on two super weak pawns that are only defended by the king. Here, Yudison plays a very reasonable looking move, saving the knight with knight to b6, which is currently hanging, but this proves to be a fatal mistake. He should have played g6 first, and even then, it's not clear, you know, giving up this f6 square, allowing the h-file or f-file to be opened here, doesn't look appealing, but Tate just plays rook across to h3, exerting so much pressure on the black king now, and Yudison's forced to make some horribly ugly moves, knight to f8, defending this h7 square. Tate carries on the attack, ruthless, f6, hits the bishop, hits the pawn, hangs a knight, because apparently every move in this game is a sacrifice. Knight takes knight, and instead of going for the bishop, Tate takes that much more valuable g7 pawn in front of the king. King takes g7, and then out of nowhere, the dark squared bishop finds itself immaculately positioned on that dark squared diagonal. Tate is making use of his pieces superbly, and while he is down 2 knights for 1 pawn, he is completely winning here. The king goes back to g8, solemnly conceding the dark squares here. Anything that would have gone to f6 could have been taken by the pawn, the g-file could have been opened, that would have been a disaster. And this is where Tate just plays the crowning move of the game, really. G6. This move crashes open at the position in front of the king. There are 3 ways that this pawn is hanging. But if you take with the h pawn, there is checkmate here. If you take with the f pawn, there is check, knight here, check, king here, and after rook takes h7, sorry, there is going to be inevitable checkmate on f7 or even g7 with the bishop. And if the knight takes the g6 pawn, then we're going to see check, king here, and you could play bishop g7 mate, or you could go for the far more flashy queen h8, knight takes h8, rook h8 checkmate. So let me repeat, this pawn is hanging in 3 different ways, all of which result in certain checkmate. And after bishop f6, trying to get on that diagonal, trying to put up some defense, we see g takes f7, forking the king and rook, king h8, and then finally, now that that g file is open, now that that g pawn from move 9 went g4, g5, g6, and then took on f7, we see Tate slide into the g file with the rook. And after rook goes to e1, that's how dire this situation is. The rook needs to give itself up entirely because it was already hanging, and there is a threat of checkmate on the g8 square. So obviously that can't happen because this is now pinned to the king. We see rook takes rook, bishop takes bishop, and then rook to e8. Here the threat is if they move the queen, then we can take this knight, and after the rook takes, checkmate on the h7 square. So knight f6 here, counter-attacking Tate's queen. But after rook takes here, if they were to take the queen, then this rook is hanging. Inevitably this knight and this knight are then going to be hanging. That's just a lost game. So instead, Yudison goes for, after rook takes, recapturing the rook, and then the queen just saves itself. And actually, I mean, white is barely even up on material, but the problem is this pawn and these 2 pieces. I mean, knight to e4, queen h4, stepping back, hitting the knight. Knight to f6 now, rook g3. Let's get back on that g file because this pawn is way defended. We don't mind, because after knight 8 to d7, we're going to play queen g5, and Yudison resigned here. There is nothing to do about this checkmate. There is nothing to do if you move the knight. For instance, let's go to here, then there's even ideas of queen here, rook takes, and then obviously promoting to a rook because you can with checkmate. It's just completely lost after queen g5, and Tate wins an incredible game. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video and you're new, I'd really appreciate a subscribe, leave a comment, leave a like. All that interaction really helps grow the channel. If you want to see more Emory Tate content, I love covering his games. He was an extraordinary player. And yeah, let me know how you found it. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.